So I'm here with Professor Joe Regenstein, a professor in food science. And Joe, you have sort of special qualifications for having this conversation about religion and GMO. I wonder if you could describe a little bit of your background.
I am a practicing Jew, but more importantly, over the years, we've developed something called the Cornell Kosher and Halal Food Initiative, which is an initiative program that is specifically designed to deal with the interface between religious law and the food industry, recognizing a number of stakeholders, including the religious supervisors, the food industry, which justifies the program as part of the state of New York's activities, also consumers who may be Jewish or Muslim, but also consumers who have other needs that might be fit by buying the appropriate food, and also the government, as the issue of how do you regulate GMOs and other materials comes up. Sometimes the need to consider the religious aspects can be part of those discussions.
Are GMOs kosher? I mean, what are the considerations, and how do we know?
Initially, our government, the first GMO product for food was chymosin, which is essentially known to most people as calf rennet. It's the cheese clotting enzyme.
Yeah.
And it was a number of companies had put the gene from a calf into a food-approved microbe through genetic engineering. And a number of them then had petitioned the government, the Food and Drug Administration, to allow it to move forward. And both groups had to decide in this process. And so, in fact, the rabbis, by the time FDA approved it, now they did it in a shorter time than FDA, which I think is interesting. The decision was that those genetic modifications that were being discussed at that time were acceptable. And the rabbis used two important forms of logic. First of all, and this is from the Jewish side, the issue is that this is microscopic, so it, in a sense, doesn't exist. You can't see it. And the other thing was that in a very loose sort of way, the rabbis do accept statistics, not in the modern statistical sense, but the fact is that to make that gene in sufficient quantities, you took one gene from a cow or calf or milk-fed cow, and you reproduced it a number of times in test tubes and kept growing it up to larger and larger amount. So the one that actually was injected into the first bacteria probably did not statistically come from the calf or the cow. Okay. And subsequently, as you went through multiple generations of these bacteria, again, even if the one that you had put in happened to be chance, one in some trillion or so, it still would not be the one that eventually was used to seed the starting culture.
Well, so in both of these cases, it sounds like there are some sort of base background religious principles that are now being informed by the science. It sounds pretty technical, right?
People looking in think of these as essentially carved in stone, as Moses had gone up to the mountain and came back with stones.
Yeah.
But these are both living religions. They may be very traditional. They may go back quite far in time, but they both have what I call legal structures, because they really work in both cases on case law and the issue of questions, and they do actually deal with some very complex technical issues.
So you've described one process whereby a kosher community essentially decided this GMOs were okay, or at least this particular genetic modification was okay. Are there a variety of opinions on that? Are there different standards? Would everyone accept it as kosher?
It appears at this point that in terms of bacterial genetic modification as currently done,
Yeah.
where you're adding 2, 3 genes for specific purposes, but the animal is not changed, or the bacteria or the plant is still a corn plant, there are no issues in the Muslim or Jewish community, with the caveat that in the Muslim community the source of the gene is of concern.
Yeah.
If it were animal, specifically porcine, there would be a concern. But otherwise, those have been accepted pretty widely. Again, everyone, I'm not in a position to say, but commercially, they are being used in Muslim communities, in Muslim countries. They are being used widely in the Jewish community.
Now, you mentioned something about the consumer acceptance side of this. I mean, so in essence, it sounds almost as if, this might be accepted as kosher, it might be accepted as halal, but then you still have to convince Muslims or Jews that this is a technology I want to actually take part in. Is that a separate religious consideration, or is that just simply my own preference?
The example that's probably more generalizable and certainly shows in both Muslim and Jewish communities, the role of gelatin, which is widely used in things like yogurt and Jell-O, the trademark from Kraft,
Yeah.
Officially called a water dessert gel, by the way. Nobody ever uses that term.
I remember that.
Marshmallows, etc. Those are of concern to Muslims all the time, because if pork gelatin is used, there's no flexibility. Technically, there are liberal Orthodox rabbis. So they're Orthodox rabbis. They're normative. They're in the traditional community who believe that pork gelatin is kosher. And there is lots of historical documents within the Jewish community, long before we're talking about modern commercial foods, that agree with that interpretation. And some of the major certifying agencies in that case have taken the stand that those rabbis are probably correct, and it probably is acceptable to use this material. However, trying to explain to a Jewish consumer that our organization is allowing something from pork into their food
Yeah.
is not something we want to do. So the normative standard in America today is that all of those agencies do not allow a pork gelatin, or even therefore a beef gelatin from from a non-religiously slaughtered animal. And that is a mixture of religious interpretation and something of a business, political, social, emotional response to try to balance their credibility. So again, the normative mainstream Orthodox community will not use any such gelatins, not because it is technically prohibited, but simply because they don't want to have to explain it and understand it. They don't want to have pork in it.
Is there that possibility then that, and perhaps this hasn't happened and it's already done, but you take that gene from a pig, you put it in something, and from the point of view of all the science and the technical parts of the religion, this is perfectly kosher. But the consumer thinks there's a problem here, and I don't quite like this, and so it may not get that label.
I think at this point, both communities are being very cautious, because there are some tremendous advantages to genetic modification. As I said, like chymosin, I mean, both communities, it has made cheese much simpler. And so there is kind of a sense, I don't know if they've as articulated, I get it indirectly in working with them, that for now they want to make sure that whatever they approve are things that don't raise issues. Even if the issues aren't real, they don't want their consumers to be worried about what they're doing, and so they're sort of
Okay.
almost as we used to when I was a student here at Cornell in loco parentis. They are taking on the responsibility of kind of keeping things so that there is no such religious question around these materials.
So they're almost sort of protecting the more conservative sets of consumers, potentially.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that, there's no point in approving a genetic modified porcine lipase at this time. I mean, there are other ways to deal with it that the kosher community has dealt with it in the past.
If I were a kosher or halal consumer, what exactly would I need to know about GMOs to understand this in my sort of religious context?
Again, it depends at what level you want to know about this in many ways. Remember that at some level in both communities, foods are marked as kosher or halal. And so if you trust the rabbis, and that's why the trust thing is so important, if you trust a particular agency, a particular symbol on a package,
Yeah.
then you really don't have to be a food scientist.
So are GMOs kosher or halal?
The simple answer is yes, they are kosher, and yes, they are halal. In both cases, one needs to go into a little more detail to understand what is and what is not kosher, what is and what is not halal.